Right. Welcome back, folks, to the Get a Grip on Life podcast. On today's show, I have author, humanitarian, philanthropist, and environmental advocate J.R. Harber, the author of The Future Was Now. But before we get into that, I'd like to tell you that most people who listen to podcasts actually think, hey, why don't I start a podcast? Well, you can do that by going to getagripstudios.com. That's getagripstudios.com. How's it going, JR?
It's going well. How are you?
Doing well, man. Tell me a little bit about how you sort of conceive the idea, because when I read your bio, I see someone that's got a couple things going on: philanthropist, environmental advocate, humanitarian. How did it lead you into becoming a fiction author?
Yeah, I think like a lot of people, I always had a ambition to write a novel at some point in my life, and did some creative writing in my youth, I'll say, and have been successful in business, been fortunate, and been able to kind of pursue some other pursuits in life. Some of the things you mentioned, as well as writing. And really kind of the inspiration for this novel was more or less current events. I was started writing about 3 years ago, just after our last election cycle. And I got a few stories and hopefully more books in this series to come. I've got those planned, currently working on book number 2. But the current events and just a lot of stuff in regard to AI, Big Brother, surveillance, kind of police state, rise of fascism, universal basic income, destruction of our environment, all these different things. And tried to look into the future a little bit and kind of paint a picture of a dystopian world, near set future, about 100 years in the future. And after the civilization has kind of melted down and we've reset from there. So I think it is somewhat of a cautionary tale. It's definitely a story about, there's a love story, coming of age story. I think it's a pretty cool story with today's events going on, in the narrative. The previous civilization was brought down by a pandemic, so I think it's fairly relevant to today's current events.
So this dystopian fantasy fiction is extremely popular genre right now. Okay, and why do you think that so many people are fascinated with fictional ideas that are showing times where Western culture has collapsed? Why do you think that's part of the zeitgeist today?
I think in a lot of ways, people are feeling kind of helpless to the situation. And they are also trying to look into the future a bit. And I think, and also be entertained at the same time. So I think you kind of combine all those things, and people want to, you can kind of go down different rabbit holes as far as, what if this were to happen? Okay, what's our future going to be? What if this were to happen? And you can kind of play all those, multiverse theories out in your head, and kind of take, whatever you can from that. I think that's part of it, in my opinion. I think it's been a pretty popular genre for a long time, but with, modern technology, and, we're kind of outpacing some of the stories from years past that, we're, like, a good example is the Back to the Future film, where we've already passed that future date and time. Or, obviously 1984, the list goes on and on. So we're kind of in this uncharted territory where I think a lot of sci-fi writers even haven't kind of gotten to yet, and so now you've got kind of maybe some new people looking at different beyond today, and what's that possible future look like. And I just think it's intriguing to people because they can draw some parallels to their current lives.
Do you actually believe that we're on the path to destruction?
I think there's a lot of paths. I think that there's a path that leads there for sure. Um, I think you can change course, obviously, and you don't really know when or how that's going to happen. I think our use of resources and kind of destruction of the environment, and there's a lot of different things I could go on and on, but there's a lot of reasons why I think we're on a course that leads to destruction currently. Now, if we can veer off that course, I think that's yet to be determined. I think one of the if you can draw a bright side from this current pandemic situation, is that we've noticed how much of an impact we have on the environment, and people, in LA, they can see for miles now. They haven't seen that far in 150 years, because of pollution and things like that. So I think people are noticing that there's other ways to do things, i.e., the video chat we're having now, as far as working and telecommuting and things like that. There's ways to do things that don't make as much of a footprint on the planet, and that you can really see those differences. I think without something like this, we wouldn't have been able to see that stark difference, because why else would everything have just shut down? You know what I mean? And planes aren't flying, cars aren't running, and people aren't, creating more pollution. So I think that the time will tell is really the answer to that question.
It's I'm trying to figure out sort of, there's different kinds of people. So within this regard, so I've interviewed quite a few futurists and people that call themselves futurists, or people that call
Right.
themselves socio Darwinists or evolutionary psychologists and this sort of thing. And I've read a lot of books about this thing, and there seems to be a line. And in the middle of the line, you have people that, and this is a real thing, that see humans as sort of diseased, naked apes who are, in a way, something like cockroaches on the earth.
Right.
And in a sense, even though they don't overtly say it, they think the best thing that would to happen to the earth would be the extinction of humans. In a way, you feel that kind of vibe from them, that there's a
Right.
negativity towards
Our impact.
our consciousness itself, like the fact that we're conscious of our environment and can manipulate it and are aware of the future, and that's the problem. And they kind of pair up with AI kind of researchers and that, and this AI thing, and it's like, well, what AI is going to do is realize that the problem is humans and get rid of us, right? And there's sort of that side of it, and the other side of it is, I think, a pragmatic, positive message, one that's pro-human, with some caveats of how we have to live. Which side of that fatalistic fate versus destiny line? I kind of think it's kind of like a fate and a destiny. Some people see it as a species that is like unto God and is going to eat Eve's apple. And on the other side, you have these people that are very fatalistic and doom and gloom and chicken little, the sky is falling kind of people. Let's all go run into the fox's den. Which side of the line are you on? Or are you not? Are you standing in the middle?
Yeah, I think that I will say that I think there's a balance in nature, and humans are a part of the balance of this tiny marble in space called Earth. It's a closed ecosystem unless it's coming from a asteroid or something. Um, so we all have to figure out how to make it work together. We're kind of in charge of that, because we do have the consciousness that you mentioned, and I think the beaver is the second, most manipulative of its habitat of any animal on Earth, other than humans. But we're ahead by a long shot in front of the beaver. So we I think that there's population control and population awareness is something that's got to be part of the plan. I don't think that has to be something that's let everybody get sick and die, and that's going to help ease the population or whatever. I don't think that's the way you do it. I think you do that through um, motivating people to have children, certain numbers of children, and at certain ages when it's best for society to keep an even population growth and death model, over time, and you don't have these big waves like the baby boomers or like what Japan's going through now. And I'm pro, but I am pro if we can change kind of things. I think one of the things that I use in my book is that most of the residents in this new civilization, they live in more like what you would call maybe a hamlet or a village or a small town. Is agrarian based. There's universal basic income, so you don't have to go out and do a job because you don't want to. The only way you can trip that up is by doing things that are illegal and breaking your social contract. And that's how it's going to get you sent to work, which isn't a thing you do. It's a place you go. It's more of like a Soviet era gulag, basically the last people putting together iPhones and stuff in a kind of sweat shack environment, that kind of thing. But as far as the communities are set up, it's more to, if you look at like post-industrial revolution, everybody thought it was a great idea to congregate in these big cities. And that's where the population masses went back in even if you look at the late 1800s, early 1900s. I think if you look at the way towns were set up back then, is more of what we need to be doing, where you've got local based food supply that's coming in. You're not depending on these crazy supply chains where I'm eating a grape that came from Chile or somewhere, like it doesn't make any sense. And, so you're regionalizing and localizing your food chains and a lot of things like that. And so that's where I think society needs to kind of go personally. Now, the society I've created in my book, don't get me wrong, I'm not all for everything they do. And I think with everything, there is kind of a price. And that's part of what my book proposes to the reader, is to take in all these things that are happening, all this stuff, surveillance. Google knows everything you want to do. There's algorithms that can probably predict right now what you're going to do next week with some pretty, certain accuracy. And they're tracking your phone. They can, listen to your calls. All this stuff's being done. You're being surveilled. Now, to what extent does the government or private industry use that kind of thing? We don't know. But I think with anything like this future I kind of paint in the society, there's a price. If you want to be safe from COVID or you want to be safe from terrorists, you're going to have to give up some of your personal privacy to do that. And if you get a whole wave of the whole world deciding, hey, we're going to give all that up, those things don't get clawed back very often. So I think we're in a time right now where there's people don't even know all the ramifications of what this is going to have, but it is going to have a pretty big effect in that way. And, maybe some of that's good, maybe some of that's bad, but I think also people are learning that living in downtown Manhattan, while it is cool, and I love Manhattan and go there often, if there's a pandemic or a natural disaster or something like that, it's probably not where you want to be.
I think when you say price, I think what I think of is sort of the term that might be better used as trade-off.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And so, but what's interesting to me, and I've seen this over the last 5 years, maybe 10, of reading different news sources and that, and what kind of I would say I'm concerned and unsettled by what seems to me to be the reduction in popularity of liberty and freedom. And there almost seems to be a desire among Americans. I'm Canadian, but there almost seems to be a desire among Americans for a more authoritarian government. And I'll just throw this at you in a way. So a lot of people who dislike Donald Trump, they would state that they dislike him because he appears to be somewhat of a fascist to them. Now, I would say that most people don't know what fascism is, but he appears to be to them to be a bully, say, and a very sophisticated one at that, and very good at manipulating and getting things his way. It's kind of like the anti-Trump vibe. And then, but when you look at right now with the COVID crisis, you see those same people that are sort of left of center, admiring China. And when you look at a dictatorial system, I mean, that is a complete and total dictatorship. I mean, President Xi has basically declared himself the leader forever. And that is a complete and total, it's a new system. It's a new story. We never heard it before. It's a combination of communism with state capitalism and dictatorial control. It's a new system. We don't really know what it is. They call it state capitalism, whatever. But you also have these anti-Trump side, also the left of center crowd, admiring what is a complete and total dictatorship. And to me, there's a cognitive dissonance going on there, JR.
I believe so. I think the far left doesn't know what it wants, because it backs itself into these corners of when you look at the world sometimes, they kind of get aligned with the wrong people sometimes. Like this is a good example. I think China, like you say, I mean, their form of governments, they're kind of an uncharted territory. They're kind of making it up as they go, based on having a pretty big population and being able to do certain things. And, you can't tell them that it's hard to tell them that they're wrong. I think if you look at China and you look at some of the themes I explore in this Future Society in my book, you will see that a lot of these things are already happening there. Facial recognition, cameras everywhere, state-owned apartment complexes where they've got the software hooked up to where they're monitoring everybody's coming in and out of the building. They're building algorithm. They're using algorithm to build off of that and connect all the dots to who's connected to who, and in a time of a pandemic, that's awesome, because if somebody gets it, you can look right there and they can tell you who they've talked to in the last month or who's been over to their house or whatever. So it's somehow, if that, the far left is kind of looking at that way, which I haven't read that, but that very well would be the case. I think it's kind of like careful what you wish for. You really want to live in that world. And I mean, there's other stuff out there in fiction. I've been watching Westworld. I'm a big Michael Crichton fan to begin with, but I'm also a fan of the show. And they're going into some places where kind of I delve, where you've got, systematic control via, computer, basically AI. And maybe that is a better way to run things. As far as the civil liberties in the U.S. and Trump crowd versus not anti-Trump crowd versus just don't give a crap anymore crowd, which I think there's a lot of those people out there. They're just kind of, let's face it, Trump is very good at what he does. He had a TV show, a reality-based TV show where he got to see ratings for years to be able to figure out how to manipulate a public audience via television. He's very good at it. And he doesn't play by the normal script, so no one knows what to do. It's kind of weird, that some of the base that he appeals to. I'm in, Georgia. There's a lot of Trump fans here, and the stuff about guns and kind of playing up the evangelical base and the NRA base, and trying to kind of use those things. It's interesting. if you start to look at all this, I mean, I don't know if those people really want the government, kind of spying on them either. I don't know that they really think about it that way, though. And I think the other side, like you said, they're going to bring it on from a safety perspective. And then once you kind of let the genie out of the bottle with some of this stuff, I don't think it ever goes back in.
Yeah, here's my opinion on all that. I think America's lost its story. Like, you're an author, right? So, but we actually live in stories. Okay, I believe that. So we live, when we're living under our brains. There is a story going on about what we are, and like, the battle between the USSR and the United States was a battle between competing ideologies or myths of how to live.
Yeah.
And I think America's lost its story. And, the idea that what concerns me about the whole pandemic situation more than anything else is how quickly people gave up, like have accepted this. And I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong. I'm just saying it's interesting to me how quickly people accepted that they have to stay in their homes. Like, that's a crazy idea. I mean, the motto of the state of New Hampshire is "Live free or die." Like, that's their state motto. They're not living that motto right now.
Right.
So, and so that's an interesting thing that's changed. And in some of the people, there's almost like a religious fervor around this COVID that is concerning to me, where it's like their lives are so purposeless that they need something like this to rally around. Does that make sense, JR? I don't know if you understand. I'm just kind of thinking out loud here with that. But there's almost like a religious fervor to it to some people, whereas most people are very pragmatic about it. But if you go on Twitter and you look up a hashtag, say COVID-19 or something like that, you will see people who are very passionate and wanting to be locked down for a significant period of time. And to me, I don't understand that at all.
Well, I think part of the big part of that is fear factor. It's not, live free or die. There's some people out there thinking live free and die. Like that living freely is going to cause their death or cause the death of someone else if they're carrying it and they don't know, or they bring it back to a loved one or something like that. So I think that's part of it. I think when you add the fear factor into things, you really, you can really do stuff to people. And in my book, the water, all water sources are tainted to the degree that you'll get the bug, which is a real thing. Which there's bacteria you can catch in freshwater sources that can go up your nose and get to your brain. It's a brain-eating amoeba, basically. In my narrative, I've basically made that that's the case with all water. So all water has to be treated, and all local townships have their own water treatment plant. And you can't, if you fell in a creek or a river, you'd be afraid that you'd die. You would get this and die. Okay, so think about that. That's a similar. It's a way that, one, it's terrible, just like people dying from COVID-19, terrible. It is also a way to manipulate people, to get them to do what you want. If that's the case, and all water that you see out there, you're not going to see people swimming in it. Water itself is going to become a natural boundary to people, to towns, to cities, and things like that, to nations. And you would have a more confined, if you want people to live in a more confined area, if you start doing things, if stuff like that starts happening, then it's going to happen all on its own, because people, inherently don't want to die. And the self-preservation in their brain kicks in. And, some people are introverted anyway, so it's not as hard for them. But I think the self-preservation thing is what ultimately you can use to get people to do pretty much whatever you want. Terrorism is a good example too. I mean, Patriot Act, we gave away. We haven't if you look at all the Snowden stuff and everything like that, there was a crisis that happened, 9/11, and in the aftermath of that, there were a lot of things changed as far as the way private citizens can be surveilled in this country. And there again, those things really haven't ever come back. So I think you're going to see another wave of that. And if it's all under safety and people preservation of life, you can sell people on a whole lot if preservation of life is what your cure you're giving them.
I think fear is the wrong word. I think we can more accurately describe it. So fear is broken up into a couple different types.
Right.
So there's anxiety, there's terror, and there's paranoia. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's probably more, but those are the first three that popped into my head. And you know that song by Buffalo Springfield, For What It's Worth?
Yep.
Paranoia strikes deep. Into your life it will creep. Right?
Yep.
And it starts when you're always afraid. And then you step out of line, the man comes and takes you away.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
So I think what we're dealing with right now is paranoia. And I think that paranoia was created. And I think the result of paranoia is for people to behave in a herd mentality, right? And to follow whatever is happening and to go along with it. And and then it's interesting. I interviewed a sociobiologist, which is basically the application of evolutionary principles to society. Okay. And so what her point was is that we need to turn to science for our answers. But I think a lot of these problems right now, whether it's COVID-19 is not a virus. The paranoia is the virus. And the problem with COVID-19, I think what's going to come out is that it's actually a moral problem. It's a problem of lying. And those lies started in China we're going to find out that I think likely we're going to find out that it was released from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Or we're going to find out that it was released because there's two actual labs in Wuhan that study bat viruses and try to make vaccines for SARS, and COVID and these types of diseases. And I think we're going to find out that this is either an altered virus or an unintentional release or an intentional release. And in order to create paranoia in the population. And so, but the problem is not the virus. The problem is not the deaths. The problem is the moral decay that is caused by the virus. And I think a lot of the issues that people say we need to solve with science are actually moral issues. Like pollution is not a science issue, it's a moral issue. Polluting your environment is morally wrong. Right? So if you're trying to solve it, you have to appeal to people's hearts and minds. Or you have to put them in a state of permanent paranoia, one or the other. And it seems to me that we're choosing the paranoia rather than the hearts and minds.
Yeah, I agree. Paranoia is a real killer and a real mood influencer and a real population control method. Really, if that's what it's being used for, that's been manipulated in the past, and I think that with today's current situation, it's interesting. I'd like to know, as would a lot of people, what the genesis of this virus is. I read an article, or it was an article about an article from a number of years back from someone in Hong Kong wrote basically having this huge population in southern China that is fond of eating bats and doing things like that in these wet markets and a huge reservoir of COVID viruses in bats, that this is just a kind of ticking time bomb waiting to happen, that it's going to do this species jump. So whether it jumped naturally or it was something that was lab created or let go, who knows? And I don't, who knows if we'll ever know the real truth. But there again, now the genie is out of the bottle as far as that goes. I think, like you say, the moral issue versus, are we gonna save our problems that way, or are we going to save our problems through science, or is it both? I think that a lot of times, in my opinion, I think social media and in general, there's a lot of things that we've kind of drawn out of our society that aren't really good, that make us more susceptible to manipulation. And I think we've all kind of just, not all of us, but a lot of people have kind of given up a lot of that. And it's, I saw something one time as far as it was talking about why people watch, um, or read tabloid mags or watch TMZ or things like that. Like, what's the addictive nature of that? And it's that in, primate DNA and chimpanzees, they can see where the leader, if he does things, the other chimps watch that leader and they do the same thing. They try and emulate those same things that they're doing because they think that somehow that's going to make them successful. So this whole culture of materialism and consumerism and okay, this guy's got a nice car now. He's cool, so I'm going to emulate him by trying to get a nice car because then I'm successful. This whole thing is and I mean, I just think that it's kind of taken on a life of its own, and I don't think that we really understood all that. And I think that as you can see in the last election with the Russia's meddling and bots and this certain ads they're putting on Facebook. I mean, this is a huge technique to control populations that everybody is just bought into, hook, line, and sinker for the most part. And now it's there. And then if you add in something like this with that, then it just it's easier to do. But I don't think obviously the virus is terrible. It's a reason for people to stay home in some places, and other jobs or professions or where you live, it's not. I live on a 200-acre farm. My nearest neighbor is a mile away. So I'm pretty good at social distancing, but I can walk around and ride a horse or play with my dog or do whatever I want. So that's nice. So it's kind of odd for me, having lived out here for a number of years and had.
Let me interrupt you here for a second though, because I used to live I lived on a farm for 11 years. But
Nice.
you said a lot of things there that I think are interesting, and I want to kind of unpack them a little bit. So the first thing you talked about was tabloid news, and then you talked about consumerism, right? And I just want to say that I think tabloid news is not a motivation for consumerism. I think tabloid news is much darker than that. I think it's Schadenfreude, and what's happening with chimpanzees, we know, and with humans, is when we're looking at tabloid news, we're looking at negative news about famous people. And what that does for us is it makes us feel better about it makes our negative side of our personality that we know about ourselves feel better, because very accomplished people also have all sorts of problems in their lives. Okay.
Yeah.
And so it's like a form of really bad form of negativity, where it's an envy-based Schadenfreude, where you're enjoying watching the collapse of. Sorry, I just got to mute this guy out here. So that's the first thing, and the second thing is that consumerism. Again, consumerism is the motivation of people for greed, and then you add Facebook into that, which is basically an envy generator. So Facebook thrives on generating envy. And then you talk about influencing elections like Russian bots. Well, America is guilty of influencing every election in the entire world since the 1950s. Okay, so it shocks me beyond belief, the naivete of Americans when they talk.
I'm not naive to that. No.
Yeah, I mean, America is the most guilty of influencing elections negatively and trying and treating the populations of other countries as tools for foreign policy. And Americans are very naive to this. And I'm obviously you're not. But what I'm saying is that when you check each one of those boxes, JR, they're all moral issues. They're all moral issues. They're not science issues. And I think when we're discussing these things, everybody talks about solutions to the problem, which are based on science or technology or control of populations and so on and so forth. But nobody talks about whether or not they're morally wrong. And influencing the elections of other democracies is morally wrong. Um, Incenting people to greed is morally wrong. Um, Schadenfreude is a really negative emotional place for people to live in on a daily basis. Having online tools like Twitter, which basically brings out the worst in people, they get to hide behind a Twitter handle and insult one another. And then you have it's interesting because each one of these social medias is like the expression of one of the seven deadly sins. Like Instagram is vanity,
Right.
Facebook is envy, uh, Twitter is rage. I mean, each one of these social medias is basically uniquely manipulating the worst parts of human nature and expanding and exacerbating them. And these are moral. These are moral issues. They're not. They're not science issues. They can't be solved by technology. Technology, in fact, exacerbates them. What's interesting to me is that you're thinking about the future as a science fiction writer. What's interesting to me with all this sort of stuff when I think about it is that what seems to be the scientific solution to every problem always becomes the next problem.
Right. Well, I've got the answer for you, and I do think it is morally based. But the difference is that I I think that even if you look at through a religious or moral lens, I think we have to admit that we're a flawed species. I think mankind is flawed. I think we have to admit that we are flawed. That doesn't mean that our flaws are good; they're bad. But that we're not perfect, and I think that's step one. And then secondly, I think in my book, in my thought process of why you would set up a new society, because at the end of this civilization, it's put together by the thinkers and the billionaires and all the smartest guys in the room, and they come up with this on a very somewhat pragmatic basis, right? For the way this new society is going to run and manage itself and govern itself. And part of what they use in my estimation with the universal income is and I don't know if greed is the right word, but I think greed is what is going to take us down. But I think greed is what is ultimately going to redeem us. I do think these are moral issues. If you grew up and you were taught and you believe that you don't hurt other people, you shouldn't hurt the environment, you shouldn't pollute the environment, you shouldn't lie, you shouldn't cheat, you shouldn't steal, you shouldn't kill people, you shouldn't do any of those things. If you're raised that way, then maybe you're less susceptible for these kind of exacerbators that you mentioned, the Twitters and Facebooks of each one of these kind of seven deadly sins. I've never thought about it that way, but that's interesting. You're less susceptible to that, and you would live and consume resources and do the right thing anyway, whether the government surveils you or tells you to do it or makes you do it. Right? You're going to do it anyway because that's your belief system. Okay. But not everybody's like that. So I think if you use human greed is its most powerful weapon, I think, in a way. If you look at money and you look at all the things done that have been for the sake of making a dollar or a pound or a lira or whatever it was over civilization, there's been a lot accomplished. So I think money is a huge motivator. I think that if the government or my government or government in general, I think rewarding people with a carrot versus a stick, you can get them to take the moral, the proper road. You see what I'm saying? Whether they feel like it's really good or not, they will do it because they're going to get something from it. You know what I mean? And I think that's a pretty powerful way to manipulate society for the better.
So
Really.
you're making a case for the universal basic income.
Yeah, with strings
Okay.
attached.
Well,
Yes,
what's
with
interesting?
strings attached.
What's interesting about what you said? You started off saying that man is a flawed species, and I was interested because I was wondering if you were going to say something like, "Yes, man is a flawed species and needs to be redeemed." Okay, which is interesting because you'd basically be describing Christianity.
Yeah.
Okay, because what you're saying, that's exactly the story of Christianity from Adam to Christ. And if you
Yep.
look at it from a mythological perspective, like let's say we're beyond religion. Okay, let's say we're beyond that as a species. Okay, let's just propose that as a hypothesis
Right.
that humans have their knowledge, they're like unto God, they're Adam's apple, eating the Adam's apple or Eve's apple kind of deal, and we've gone beyond it now, and we know more than religion can teach us. If you accept that humans are flawed and they need to be redeemed, everyone has to accept that story somehow, has to digest that story and live it. Okay. And, that's exactly what the West is based upon, is those ideas. And right now, I think, in my opinion, we either have to readopt our old ideas somehow, repackage them, remake them, or we need new ideas to live by, that we all live by. And multiculturalism and communism and socialism and universal basic income, all these things are just tools. They're not solutions to the problem. The problem is that everybody has to get on the same page with what's the difference between right and wrong. And if we can't get on the same page with that, the outcome is going to be that we need to be controlled by some force, whether that's a world government, whether it's China taking over the world, whether it's the United States government becoming authoritarian. We need to be controlled if we can't get our story straight as a people.
I agree, and in my book I use something called a social contract, which is not a new term, but in my narrative it's a little more impactful than if you just said it today. It's the matter of life or death, or universal basic income, and do whatever you want, never have to fear for money or a roof over your head, versus thrown into a gulag. I mean, so that's the difference. And breaking that social contract is what'll get you there. So I think I agree. Whether you frame it as religion or it doesn't matter what you hang on it. I think a lot of these, obviously, socialists and socialism gets thrown around a lot these days, and most people don't even know what the hell these words mean anyway.
No, for sure. They have no idea what they're talking about.
It's pretty annoying and stupid, so it doesn't really mean anything. When you make it when nobody knows what something means, then it loses meaning, in my opinion. And we've kind of done that with a lot of things in our modern society. But I think ultimately the social contract, as you say, everybody has to get on the same page with what's right or wrong, and then people need to live by that, and then that's how we're going to have a better world and a better society for everybody. Now, how you get people to live by the social contract? Is it by getting them to go to church and reading certain scriptures that would say, do unto others as, have them do unto you, and things like that? Is it by incentivizing them in their daily lives to make good decisions, even if they might not be predisposed to making good decisions, like a lot of people on earth are not? I think we've kind of dumbed down our society to the extent that it's, living 30 seconds at a time on its phone. That's the bandwidth of our attention span for a lot of people, and that's the way you get it, people, and you use all the tools that you mentioned earlier to do that. Now, what's the motivation to do it? Is it to go get them to buy a new iPhone? Is it to get them to buy a new car? Is it consumerism? Is it to help make the environment better because we're headed towards a crisis with our environment? That we need to kind of get on a different path there, which because the path we're on is just not sustainable. And whether you think it's a moral issue or not, it's not sustainable. I mean, I think it is a moral issue, but how are you going to get people to do that? So, are you going to convert a bunch of people, or are you going to use what people respond to get them to do the things that they should do anyway? And make the right choices that they should make anyway, without telling them to do it. Because as we know, even if something's good for somebody and you sit there and tell them to do it, they're going to be like, I'm not doing that. They don't want to. No, people don't want to be told to do. People don't want to be preached at to do. People don't want to be the government tell them to do.
They don't even want to be nudged.
No, they don't. They're totally encamped on with this tribalism in our current society is just kind of off the charts, and it's just not good. But what can you get everybody to agree on? That money makes the world go round, and if you had a little bit more of it, are you going to hand it back? If you went around to even some people that you would consider very wealthy and said, here's some free money, do you want it? You think they're going to hand it back to you and say, no, I've got enough money here, I'm going to give it back? No, they're even going to take it. Everybody's going to take it. And the people who really need it, they're really going to want it, and they're really going to take it. And if you can get them to make good decisions that way by not shoving it down their throats or preaching it to them, but getting them to see it as in their best interest, everybody's going to take it. And the people who really need it, they're really going to want it, and they're really going to take it. And if you can get them to make good decisions that way by not shoving it down their throats or preaching it to them, but getting them to see it as in their best interest, that's the only way you're going to get people to make good decisions. And that's my firm belief.
They taught chimpanzees to use money.
I didn't know that.
So this experiment happened where they gave the chimps like coins or something, like some sort of currency that humans would use, like a coin.
Right.
And there was different coins, and the chimps would have to come in, and they would come in with these coins, and they learned to give like 3 for an apple, 4 for a chocolate bar, and whatever, right? And you know what happened? The female chimps started selling sex for coins. I mean, seriously, like,
yeah, world's oldest profession.
Yeah,
in the chimp world.
Okay, so like, yeah, you can motivate people, but you don't really. The researchers had no they shut down the experiment after that because they felt it was unethical to continue. But so let me throw one at you here. Okay, I think that we're spiritual beings. Okay, and I think that I believe in natural selection. I mean, I believe in Darwinism and evolution, but I'm not sure about natural selection. And this is really weird. And I'm gonna make a point here. I think there's something else going on. I think there's life wants to be alive. Like there's something there's something else going on, that it's not just this carving away of natural selection and sexual selection. It's not that brutal. There's something deeper that's happening in whether it's plants and animals and humans and everything. There's something deeper. Do you ever see that show? I can never remember what it's called. Game of Thrones. You ever see that show, Game of Thrones?
Yeah, watched every episode.
Okay. One thing that fascinated me by that show was when, I don't know who wrote it or whatever, but he had this line that said, do you want to swear to the old gods or the new gods? You remember that?
Yep.
You want to? What are you going to? What is your allegiance to? Is it to the old gods or the new gods? And I think human beings need something to worship. I think they need something to bow down before and say that this is the highest principle that we live under. And I think without that, the abandonment of that is at our peril. And you're a Christian, and when I say that, what I mean is that You live in a country that is founded on certain stories and mythologies that are very, very deep in your mimetic soul, say, would be like a
Right.
technical description of it.
Sure.
And those moral values and whatever it is that propels you forward in the world and makes you admire, like for example, there's no human culture that admires cowardice in men. Okay, you can't find a tribe living on an island somewhere that says, yeah, the best guy is the coward, that's who we
Right.
want. All humans agree that cowardice in men is very unattractive, and if you're a coward, you're likely to be killed by your own people, right? That's a
Yeah.
human universal. And there's other human universals like, I don't, at the risk of being very controversial, um, it's I would say that it's a human universal that women who have are promiscuous, all cultures seem to look up down upon that in a certain sense. This is just the way it is. And so why are we like that? And I think that there are certain things that are deep inside of us that are not scientific in nature, and that people need to be told or need to be taught to worship something. And if that's in your case, what you're saying is that the highest motivator is greed and money, and we can use that as a type of God that people can swear to. And
They
then
already
that
do. They already
right,
do.
I agree with you. They do.
Yeah.
I think it is a God, Mammon. It has a name in the Bible, right? Mammon, right? Is a god. So this idea of who are you going to swear your allegiance to, the old gods or the new gods? I think it's a question for our society right now, Jr. It's a good question, and is it Mother Earth? Is it is it human decency? Like human decency is not a god. Mammon's a god. It will motivate people to do crazy things, greed, these sorts of things. Or is there a higher purpose? Is there something else we can reach for that's above that? Because I really don't think I don't think it's possible for people to return to Christianity. I think Nietzsche got it right when he said God is dead and we have killed him. But when he said that, um, he was mourning it. Most people don't realize he wasn't sneering it. He was mourning it. He was predicting the disaster from it. And so we need gods. We need to worship something. We need redemption. We need a story. We need to know that we're flawed and that we can be redeemed. And how do we create that story? I mean, that's what our society needs right now.
Yeah, I agree that story is very powerful. And I think you mentioned Game of Thrones. And I don't know if you watched the last episode, but it seemed a bit anticlimactic if you watched the whole show. But at the end, the Peter Dinklage character, Tyrion, ended with a speech. Yep, sorry. He ended with a speech, and it was basically that story is that's what he used as the basis of why things should be the way they are and what motivates people was story. That was his conclusion, and the story of this Bran, who ultimately ended up taking the throne, was what people had to buy into as to why he needed to be the ultimate leader at the end of the day, who sat on the throne, was his backstory and story that people could believe in, like you said. So I do think that is very powerful, and I think people are kind of hardwired to um, want to buy into stories or listen to stories, and I think when you frame that, with a religious story, then it can be even more powerful. I do think there is a spiritual nature to life in general, and I think that if you don't see that, um, that I don't know. I think you're kind of missing out, and you're probably maybe, I don't know. To some degree, it's hard to you start getting into existential meaning of life type questions, and what does all this matter, and who where am I going when I die, and who do I believe in, and that's normally where, a lot of, I think, the religion is, part of where you grow up and what you're taught, and this has always fascinated me. If you just, you know, grew up on an island and were never taught a religion, I mean, like, where do you seek that out?
They all
Like,
have
because
their
most people,
stories. They all have their
yeah,
stories.
and
So
most people grow up with one or the other, and you don't get to pick that at birth. I didn't
it's for
choose
sure.
to be born in Georgia and be raised as a Methodist. I mean, that was my upbringing. So you don't get to choose that. Um, so
But you get to choose whether you honor it or reject it.
Sure. Or you piecemeal gravitate towards fringe elements of any religion. You can find ways to hurt people and do bad things. Or you can gravitate towards the good part of it. You know what I mean? So, like, obviously, Islam is a big um, topic over the last, 20 years, and jihadists and all these different things. And, so I think, there's examples in many religions where you can find the good and bad in any religion or in anything in life. I mean, I think there's without good there is no bad. I mean, I think there's a yin yang relationship to the universe, and there's light and dark and things like that. And I think ultimately, what is our goal for society? What is the, I've got a I try to look at the end game and work backwards from there. So, like, what do we want our society to look like? What do we want people to be able to do, and have and feel, and things like that, and be mobile or not? And how do you get there? I mean, I think it's going to be very hard to get everybody to subscribe to the same religious ideology. That's going to be pretty difficult. I don't think that's ever happened in the history of the planet. You've had Native Americans; they've all got their stories, as you say. I mean, and those are some of the most interesting ones. If you look at some of those different stories from Native Americans, it's pretty interesting of their stories. But so, I mean, are we going to try and write a new story and then everybody's going to believe in that? Or are we going to, like you say, hold on to the stories of the past and try and make all those things coexist in a way that, there's life on the planet? I think ultimately that's the key. I mean, mankind, I mean, you have to. I think this sustaining of mankind is something that I don't know if it's a universal belief or not, but if like, at some point we're all going to die. Hate to break it to you. I mean, every story ends that way, and we're all kind of, most people are, I'm the main character in my own screenplay about myself, right? And so at some point that's going to end. Do I really give a shit about what happens when I'm gone? Do I do. I mean, personally, I would like to leave the world in a better place than I found it in some respects, or be able to do some good and have this altruistic outlook on things. People could say that's easy if you have plenty of money and you're writing books and just screwing off. You know what I mean? Like, it's easy to be altruistic when you've got things. You know what I mean? And it's easy to be cutthroat when you don't.
Yeah, everybody, the America's 5 meals away, missing 5 meals away from total chaos.
Oh, of course.
Okay, right. But what's interesting is that, like, you take a guy like George Washington, not a man. George Washington is not a man. He's a symbol of freedom from tyranny.
Yeah.
Right. That's what he is to the American people. And, like, when you have situations like in, I think it's South Carolina or whatever, you have to be very careful when you take down statues, because in a way what you're doing is you're removing the archetypal pillars of what the society is standing on. So, like, for example, when we reinterpret history, what we're doing is rewriting the American myth. So if you take down, there's obviously a reason why there's statues to Thomas Jefferson or
Yeah.
George Washington or whoever the guy in South Carolina was that they had. I can't remember what his name was. But when we reinterpret these things and we take them down, but they have to be replaced by something. And if we don't replace them with something, then we are at risk of being without a story. And I actually have to get going now because I'm homeschooling my kids here. But J.R. Harber, I think you and I could probably talk a lot longer. It was really a pleasure to speak with you.
Sure.
Tell the people listening where they can find your books and buy your books and follow you a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, just if you go to Amazon, just search "The Future Was Now." It's available on Amazon and on Kindle. Yeah, hopefully it's something you want to read. I think people have more time on their hands to read a good novel these days. So
Sure.
go check it out. And enjoyed speaking with you and look forward to doing it again soon.
Yes. Hey, folks, if you're listening to this, you made it to the end. I know JR appreciates it. I know I do as well. Thank you for listening. And of course, if you're listening to podcasts, I'd say about 20% of you probably think, man, I'd like to start a podcast. And if you do, you got to go to getagripstudios.com. That's getagripstudios.com. Fully virtual. Take it anytime. Thanks for listening.